Good evening, and thank you everyone for coming. We're going to discuss, the reason we're here tonight is discuss this book called Doctor, Will You Pray For Me?
I feel like we're from outer space here or something.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, we're actually talking on a karaoke machine, but it's being filmed professionally anyways.
Yes, I apologize. It turns out that a personal karaoke machine comes with an automatic echo. So for the next event, we'll try to figure out a different kind of microphone system.
Okay,
By professional.
that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, anyways, I'm happy to say we sold all the books, but if anyone wants to buy this book,
There's one copy left.
There's one copy left, but I just wanted to hold it up. And if there's more people than that, you can buy it on Amazon, but not the same discount price we're giving. So, for those who don't know who Robert Klitzman is, he's a professor of psychiatry at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, and director of the Masters of Science in Bioethics program at Columbia University. He's discussing his new book. I've had the pleasure of talking to you twice. Here, we discussed your book, Designing Babies, and I forgot the other time what we discussed.
You're going to have to hold it.
I'm going to have to hold it. Oh, okay, okay. Oh, that's good.
I did a previous book called, I think was The Ethics Police, The Struggle to Make Human Research Safe.
Okay. That wasn't the topic.
Or there was also one on genetics, Am I My Genes?
Genetics,
Okay.
yes, yeah. Okay. Anyway, so I'm going to ask, I had Catherine Even here, who wrote a book called Bottle Wise, and she said, you didn't ask me the first obvious question. So I said, what's that? I said, why'd you write this book? And I didn't think of that. So why'd you write the book?
All right. Well, so do I need it? Do I?
No.
Okay, all right. So,
I do.
okay, how do I turn this off? Okay, and the recording can hear me?
Yeah, I'm
Okay, all right. Well, so first of all, I just want to thank David for inviting me, and especially to Susan and Chip Fisher for really hosting this wonderful event. So immense gratitude, so thank you. And thank you all for coming. So it's really wonderful to see old friends and new friends, et cetera, here. So I'm very grateful to you. So I wrote the book for several reasons. So the shortest answer is I wrote a previous book called When Doctors Become Patients, and I interviewed 75 physicians who became patients. And I asked them all, how has the experience of being a physician, of being a patient, affected what you now do as a doctor, having been on the other side? And they all said versions of the following. They said, patients used to say to me, Doc, would you pray for me? And I'd go, yeah, whatever, and I'd poo-poo it. And then I became a patient with whatever it was, serious disease, cancer, and didn't know if I'd survive, didn't know if I'd leave the hospital alive. And suddenly I realized how important all these religious, spiritual, existential issues are, but I have no training to deal with them. And in medical school, they were never discussed. And I don't know what to do when patients say, Doctor, would you pray for me? So one doctor I interviewed said that he was a surgeon, and he once rolled a young boy into the operating room, and he thought the kid would not survive. And at the last minute, the parents said, Doctor, would you pray with us? And they were Catholic, and he was Jewish. And he said, no. And he said, that's bothered me for years, because, I don't know, what could I have said? I mean, they're Catholic. I'm not Catholic. I don't know much about Catholicism. I'm Jewish. And what am I going to say? Say a Hebrew prayer? And so I said, well, you could have just said, well, I'm happy to stand here with you. I'm happy to, be here with you while you do that, or something like that. Or, I know that that prayer is very important for people. And then you'd hear stories or see examples of, doctor asks a patient, how you're doing? And the patient says, well, I just hope God is ready for me. Well, did you make your follow-up appointment this week? Or how you doing? Well, whatever. I'm just wondering what's going to happen to me after I die. Well, did you take your medicine this week? So again, just completely missing the point of all this. And then so I got interested in these issues, and as I mentioned, I did a few previous books. One is I wrote a book called Am I My Genes? Confronting Fate and Family Secrets in the Age of Genetic Testing. And So one of the diseases that I interviewed people who were at risk of or had was Huntington's disease, which is a terrible disease. Woody Guthrie famously had this, and if you have the gene, basically you'll die of it if you don't die of something else first. And a number of people I interviewed said things like, well, I know that I have the disease because I have the gene, but why did God give me the gene and not give it to my sister? Or why did God give my sister the gene but not me? So again, these issues came up. And the previous book I wrote was called Designing Babies, how technology has changed the ways we create children. A number of people said they were having trouble getting pregnant, undergoing IVF, and they would say things like, well, I guess God's just not, doesn't think I should have a baby, or they'll say, my sister says, I guess God didn't intend for you to have a child. And so again, these issues came up, so in the back of my mind. The other reason I wrote this is a slightly longer version, if you can bear with me, which is I spent a year in Papua New Guinea, living in a Stone Age tribe, studying cannibalism and cannibalistic rituals that led to the spread of a disease called kuru, which is the same as mad cow disease, but was spread by cannibalism in this tribe. And the people believed, the women had no meat in their diet. So when someone died, the women would consume the person after they died with their children. And as one woman said to me, she said, this will always have part of my mother inside of me, which you can sort of understand. And this is Stone Age. So they had just stone axes, they had no metal, et cetera, et cetera. And they believed they could cure the disease. They believed sorcerers caused the disease and could cure the disease. And they believed that a sorcerer would take something that belongs to you and wrap it around a stone and cast a spell on it. And they dig up stones and say, see this stone? This is the stone that killed my mother. And I'd say, well, no, kuru is caused by a little thing like an insect. And they said, well, show it to us. And I'd say, it's too small to see, you need a special machine. And they said, well, what does it look like? And I'd say, well, we don't know. And they'd say, well, have you seen it? And I'd say, no, because it hadn't been identified. And they said, that's just magic, that's just superstition. It's this stone that killed my mother. So I became interested, how we understand illness, how we may have our belief of what it is, but how also beliefs affect our understanding of science and medicine. Similarly, the people believe that they could cure the disease. They were shaman. And I said, well, who have you cured? He said, all these people I cured. And I said, well, is there anyone you didn't cure? And he said, well, that guy over there, who's the one person I thought had the disease. So I said, well, what's the treatment? And he said, well, for 2 weeks, you're not allowed to drink water or eat salt or touch a member of the opposite sex. And I cast a spell on them and give him some leaves, some herbs. So I said, well, why did anyone get sick? He said, they didn't follow the treatment. They were not a good patient. And of course, in this country, when someone doesn't get well, we often said the patient failed the treatment. We don't say the treatment failed the patient, right? We say the patient failed the treatment. So again, I got interested in how we understand not just the scientific understanding of science, but how beliefs affect this in what we think. So that's a long answer of sort of how I ended up writing the book. So I decided to sort of explore this area, and one thing led to another, and it became a book.
Okay. Well, you start the book off with about the death of your sister on 9/11. And I was just wondering, how did that tie into this?
Yeah, so as some of you may know, on 9/11, my sister Karen died, and she called her best friend and then was working for Cantor Fitzgerald, and my family, some of whom are here, and I sort of took care of them. My mother, who was then alive, took care of all the things. My sister and I went down to the FBI to list her as a missing person, and we had a memorial service, and eventually we had to sell her apartment. And then for me, my body gave out. I just sort of thought I had the flu. I lay in bed and I didn't want to move. It just hurt to move. And I didn't want to read or listen to music or watch TV. And friends said, well, this is grief. These are symptoms of grief. I said, no, I have the flu. And I'm a psychiatrist, but I didn't realize how symptoms of grief could be bodily. And we, in psychiatry, often look down at people who somaticize, right? So some general practitioners say that about half the patients they see are there for really mental health problems, or they'll complain, my back hurts, my leg hurts, my whatever hurts, and it's really a psychological issue. And we sort of look down at that, why can't they just talk about it? But I realized how much the experience is bodily. And of course, we know that anxiety, depression are involve chemical actions in the body and very much are tied to one's body. So I realized how little I knew, and that is what actually led me to write the book about doctors becoming patients. That's why I ended up being curious how other doctors deal with medical problems that they face, and that's what happened. And then I also went to my temple. I went to a temple. I went to a Buddhist ceremony. And for me, it wasn't, I was sort of sitting in the park one day and watching the leaves blow and the grass blow, like sort of nature goes on. And that to me was very comforting in a sort of a spiritual way. So that was another sort of point at which I sort of came into the book and decided to explore this area further. And also for myself, figure out, we live in a time, as you all know, of immense polarization politically in this country and religiously. So the largest religious group in America are evangelical Christians. They're about a third of America are evangelical Christians. I think 38%. This is reflected in 38% of America are evangelical Christians.
From Alabama, you're probably right.
Right. So, which is staggering. And of course, religion plays a big part in American politics and is very divisive. And so I found myself wondering, what is this thing, religion? What is spirituality? What do people believe today? Because the other phenomenon going on is that the religious landscape of America is changing. So the number of people who say that they believe nothing in particular or spiritual but not religious has gone up 6 times in the past 50 years. So about a third of America says, a third are evangelical, a third say they believe nothing in particular. And among Gen X's and Gen Z's, it's a huge number or believe in nothing in particular. And so I'm not going to ask how many people here regularly go to a church or a synagogue or a temple, but my guess is that our grandparents went more than we do, by and large, or for many people. And so religion's changing. And so I was also curious, what does this mean? As a physician, their patients, particularly at the end of life, what is that experience like for them, whether evangelical or atheist or spiritual but not religious or agnostic? What ends up being important? What does that look like? And so as I got into this, I realized that hospital chaplains are the ones who really deal in this space. And so I ended up doing extensive interviews all over the country with hospital chaplains to understand, what it is to deal with these issues today, what they find, what strikes them, et cetera.
Well, I used to work for the New York City Health Department, and I spent a week with the chaplains in King's Hospital, Kings County Hospital. And it was very interesting just to follow them around and see what they did. There was an imam, there was a rabbi, there was a priest, there was a minister, and they all got along very well, and they all, spoke to all kinds of patients. Sometimes a priest would speak to someone who was Jewish, depending on fallibility. How does a patient request a chaplain? And do chaplains routinely just come to hospital rooms?
So it's a great question. So there's been very little studies of chaplains, very little, we don't know much about them. So just as background, about 2/3 of hospitals have chaplains, 1/3 don't. Many of the hospitals that do have chaplains have volunteer local clergy who come in. So the priest comes in, or the rabbi, et cetera. But they have no training to deal with patients with other faiths, let alone patients who are atheist or agnostic or nothing in particular. And it varies hospital to hospital. Some hospitals have a lot of chaplains, some have just one chaplain. And chaplains, unfortunately, are not covered by insurance. So hospitals pay out of their own pocket for chaplains. And a lot of this is because I think there's still this divide between, science is here and all this other stuff's over there, and we're just kind of not going to pay much attention to it. So in some hospitals, like Columbia's, chaplains are often assigned to a particular ward. So they'll be assigned to the oncology service or palliative care or hospice or neurology. Other times a chaplain just goes and sees whomever. And the good side of that is that chaplains have a lot of time. In other words, they have unstructured time. And so they get to actually spend time with patients and get to know patients in ways that other staff don't. And I'll come back to that. The disadvantage is it's sort of haphazard. So a lot of chaplains will go onto a ward in the morning and say to the nurse or head nurse, is there anyone in particular I should see? And nurses are also sort of unsung heroes. Chaplains, I think, are unsung heroes, but nurses to an important degree also are. So they'll say, well, Mrs. So-and-so, she seems to be having trouble. And they'll go and talk to that person. Other times they just go room to room, so it varies. But it's really kind of haphazard who ends up seeing a chaplain, who doesn't. That being said, usually on hospice wards, palliative care wards, their chaplains are more present and more integrated. But there's still a divide. Some of the chaplains I spoke to said, what's it like working in the hospital? And they said, well, every day I have to decide which ditch do I want to die in. Like, do I want to take on physicians? Do I want to sort of put myself out there, or just kind of lay low and just do my thing? And I think because they're often not very respected in biomedical centers, they often get short shrift.
Okay. So chaplains, but in some hospitals, chaplains are employees, right?
Yes, so they're employees. Yeah, so again, in many hospitals they're employees. Some just have local volunteer chaplains. I mean, most major medical centers, Cornell, Columbia, have a chaplaincy service where there's a department. That being said, another side of this, by the way, is a number of chaplains said that there's often a chapel in the hospital, and sometimes a chapel is well placed. It's very nice. Sometimes no one knows where it is, and it's just some old patient's room or some office. It's now called a chapel. So again, it tends to be, I should say, some hospitals are Catholic and they value chaplains more, though they have a particular ideology and et cetera. And there's pictures of Jesus on every floor and the cross and all that. But most hospitals are secular, so they will have chaplains there but use them to varying degrees.
So
I was going to ask that you have national institutions that have chaplains that do medical chaplain work. That's the U.S. military and the Veterans Administration. And I wonder if you ever looked into whether they get formal training courses on how to be chaplains.
Yes, thank you. And you work at a VA, as I recall, as a physician. Yes, right. So increasingly chaplains are getting profession.
No, I'm trying to fix the. I think I fixed it.
Okay.
That's someone calling from above. I don't know. The VA, yes. So there's a whole world of chaplains that I knew nothing about, I have to say. So chaplains are increasingly getting professionalized. They want to be professionalized. They realize because I think chaplains have a lot to offer. I think if you're sick in the hospital, the only people doing any kind of psychotherapy in a hospital today are chaplains. So if you're diagnosed with a terrible disease, the only person to come and say, well, what's that like for you? How you doing? Is the chaplain. I mean, the doctor doesn't have time. He's busy focusing on the lab values. Social workers could potentially do it, but they're busy with discharge planning and trying to make sure the patient has insurance and trying to get a bed in a rehab facility for the patient or a long-term care place or a nursing home. And so chaplains occupy the space doing this, so they're valuable. So they're increasingly trying to get professionalized. There's now certification in chaplaincy. So chaplaincy, answer to this physician's question, many chaplains are getting certified, which means you have actual training in how to be a chaplain. The VA and the military are quite interesting. So I was struck that in the military, I've never been in the military, but so I'm told that chaplains are the one person everyone in the military knows is the only person you can really talk to, that it's confidential. So if you're burnt out, we know that rates of suicide and depression are going way up among soldiers, but they know that the chaplain in the military is the one person you can go and talk to, it's confidential, you don't have to sort of be talking to authority, they're sort of there for you, they listen, they're helpful, etc. So they occupy a very important role. And so in the VA system also, chaplains have an important role, perhaps more than elsewhere. Certainly, they're sort of, because in the military structure, chaplains in general are respected, they're respected in the VA. What they hear is amazing. So the chaplains I interviewed from the VA hear these horror stories about, for instance, one patient said he was on a ship in the Persian Gulf and there was an airplane coming and he had to decide, should we shoot it down or not? So he didn't know what to do. He said, yes, let's shoot it down. And it turned out to be full of kids going to their Disneyland. And he said, this has haunted me my whole life. And he's now an alcoholic, and he feels he's did a terrible thing, and he has this horrible sin, and he was raised evangelical. And so the chaplain tries to get him to focus on, focus on what we can do today, you didn't know, et cetera, and really does important work in that space. So I think VA chaplains, a lot of people in the VA have a huge amount of moral stress, and you can imagine being in the military these days in Iraq, et cetera, and in terms of purposelessness, really, in a way, given the sort of issues around why we went to war in various countries in the Middle East, like Iraq. And I should say that chaplaincy with a lot of burnout also among hospital staff. Particularly during COVID. I did a lot of the interviews during COVID, but chaplains would be incredibly burnt out, and or the staff would be doctors or nurses, and chaplains, again, were the ones to sort of respond to that. So one chaplain I interviewed said she developed chocolate rounds. So there's grand rounds and there's neurology rounds, and she said, I developed chocolate rounds. I go around with a box of chocolate and say to staff, I'm doing chocolate rounds, would you like a chocolate? And the staff member says, sure, I'd love a chocolate. And then the chaplain said, well, how are things going for you? And sometimes they cry or they tell their story, whatever, but it was very helpful. Another chaplain said that on her ward during COVID, she put up a wreath and put pieces of paper there. And she said everyone could write the name of someone who died, either a loved one of their own, a friend, a patient. And everyone on the ward, doctors and nurses, all started to put names of people who had died and put them on the wreath. And at the end, she said, I thought I'd take the wreath down. They also know you have to leave this here. It's sort of like a memorial to everything that we all went through. So I think chaplains are the ones who occupy this space. And again, biomedicine, as a physician, has done many, many things, wonderful things. Many of us are alive because of whatever medicine we're on, cholesterol medicine, heart, blood pressure medicine. But, I think there's a pendulum, and the pendulum is swung way over to the science side. A few years ago, I went with my sisters to Epidaurus in ancient Greece, which is the largest intact theater from the ancient world. It seats 10,000 people, and famously, if you drop a pin, all 10,000 people hear it. So it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. What I didn't know is that it actually was part of a hospital. So it was a compound, and there was a hospital, there was a temple, and there was a theater. And of course, and this was a center of Hippocrates, is where it was. So of course you have a hospital, you should have a temple and a theater. When you think about it, why not, right? But I think Western medicine and American medicine in the late 19th century, when we began to discover germs that are responsible for disease, we said, well, medicine's going to be scientific, and all the rest of this other stuff's quackery, and we're just going to ignore it. But of course, as the doctors who became patients told me, obviously, when you're ill, you're not thinking, oh, here's science and here's the rest of my life. It's all together. What is the purpose of my life? What is the meaning? And so chaplains really help people find purpose, hope, meaning, connection. And so I think in the VA, for instance, with, soldiers who feel, great moral injury, this is incredibly helpful for them.
I want to just say that you mentioned in your book that the Joint Commission, which accredits hospital, and if you work in a hospital and the Joint Commission is coming, everyone is terrified. Because if you don't get accredited, you can't have patients, you can't have insurance. And they have now adopted spirituality, taking care of the spirituality needs of patients. Although it's kind of like the Supreme Court saying we should be ethical, but there's no rules.
Right. Yes, so JACO is the Joint Commission of Accreditation of Hospital Organizations or something like health organizations. So you need JACO accreditation. So it says, a few years ago they added that the hospital needs to have a way of, I forget the exact words, but a way of assessing patients' spirituality, period. It doesn't say do anything about it. It doesn't say who assesses it, how often they assess it, which patients, but it needs a way of assessing it. So Doesn't mean you need to integrate it into care. Doesn't mean that the doctor needs to know about it, et cetera. So it's a baby step in the right direction, but it is no teeth. And a lot of most medical schools have nothing on spirituality, and about 40% of deans, if not more, I forget the exact number of the statistic, when asked, would you like more, they say no. So it's still sort of doesn't get the attention that it should.
So I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience to ask questions. So my question, you're a psychiatrist, as we know, and when a patient becomes very ill, some people, does it make people more religious? Does it make people angry? Probably does both. And who attends to those needs of the patient?
So
You can talk about why me.
yeah, that's right. So patients wonder why me. I mean, many of us wonder why me when things happen, right? Maybe you sort of get stuck your plane's canceled and you're stuck in LaGuardia Airport, or you have a bad disease, or your mother's a bad disease, and you wonder why me. So I think these are human questions that sort of bubble up from our unconscious, if you will. And when patients reach the end of their life, I think that I'd done work when I was in med school with a psychiatrist named Robert J. Lifton, who had studied survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and then did a book about Nazi doctors. And when he interviewed people who were survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he was the first social scientist to talk to them, he came up with a notion that people needed a sense of what he called symbolic immortality, that they needed a sense that somehow they would go on, or something would go on. I mean, of course, this is, the whole city of Hiroshima is wiped out. But they needed a sense either through religion or through nature that grass was starting to grow again at great meaning, or through their children, or through creative work, or through what he called experiential transcendence, sort of drugs and sex and rock and roll, that you're going to leave this mundane human existence, that we're not all just chemicals, but there's something more somehow. And the word spirituality, it's the word spiritus in Latin, which is breath. So the notion that there's something more than just sort of the mundane, physicality of the world around us. So I think people need some sense of something beyond themselves. And it could be nature, it could be, one man I interviewed said, I'm not religious at all, but I believe in the third law of thermodynamics, that energy is neither created nor destroyed, it just goes on. Which to me is a very sort of spiritual notion, that energy sort of goes on, but he was not religious. So again, people sort of define these things for themselves in different ways. And I think at the end of life, people need a sense of connection to something beyond them. It could be their kids, religion, etc. But for a lot of people, it has a spiritual dimension, however they define that. For some people, it's math or science, or it's art or artistic work or whatever it is. And so people at the end of life, some people have something, but what a number of these chaplains said to me that people come into the hospital with whatever their belief system has, and it often falls short. So this happens on the one hand, particularly with evangelicals, actually. So a number of them said, one chaplain I interviewed said, she's from the South, she said, I'm from the Bible, the buckle on the Bible Belt. And she's all these evangelical patients, and they come in sick, and they said, I can't believe I'm angry at God because I prayed every day, and now he made me sick. I'm angry, but I'm not supposed to be angry at God, so what do I do? And the chaplain then tries to talk to them, etc. Other people, one grizzy old man I once treated actually said, he was a mean son of a bitch, an alcoholic, and he was dying, and he said, why am I still alive? Why am I here? He was miserable. So I said, well, is there anything you want to do before you die? He said, well, it eventually came out that he hadn't talked to his kids in years. And so he actually encouraged me, called them up, and was able to establish a connection. So I think just that kind of thing. But again, it's often chaplains are the ones who talk to people about this. So as I said, in the hospital, psychiatrists are few and far between. And when they are called, it's to give medications, and usually because someone's psychotic. So they'll give a medicine to calm them down, or maybe they're depressed sometimes, they'll get antidepressants, but they're not there to talk to you about the meaning of your life and what it means. And people do have a need for that in some way, to sort of have some sense of closure or feel that they've had some sense of meaning and purpose. And so the chaplains are the ones to sort of pick up the slack and therefore do important work.
Well, I wrote an article, it was called What Happens to the Brain When We Die? And it's about a researcher at New York University who is studying people who have had heart attacks, clinically dead, and they come back, they're revived, because the brain goes on for a while. And they all, throughout the world, they all reported the same experience. And they felt a comforting presence. Nobody talked about this a bright light, but instead they felt a comforting presence. And these are people, and it was the same for people whether they were religious, whether they were atheist, whether they were black, white, brown, whatever. And it was very, very similar experiences that they all had. And I thought that was very, very interesting. The only problem with that is that we can't interview people who have actually died and didn't come back. So we don't know what their experiences were. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to questions from the audience. So please raise your hand and stand up and say who you are.
So, Bob, I'm just really interested in what you were saying about the chaplains performing psychotherapy. And you've talked a little bit about this, but I wonder if you could zero in a little bit more on it. Because I can see how chaplains can help people, who are of their faith and say, do say this prayer, or remember God loves you, and all that sort of stuff. But what do they do that's specifically, psychotherapeutic, and maybe especially when they're treating people who are atheists and don't believe in any of that, which was what my mother wasn't when she was dying.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so many of them are now getting training in psychotherapy, and mediation is another thing we can talk about. So I used psychotherapy partly metaphorically, but not entirely, but sort of addressing, what are your concerns, and, having at times do reality testing. I mean, one chaplain described a story where there was a guy who came in and had abdominal pain and came in a second time with abdominal pain, and the chaplain finally talked to him, and he would also call the nurses at 2 a.m. every night asking for pain relief, and it was bugging the nurses. So she talked to him, and it turned out that he felt this enormous, why can't you sleep? Well, I'm busy thinking about my family. What are you thinking about your family? Well, and it turned out that his mother had committed suicide, and he was worried that because of him. So she contacted his siblings, who came in and said, no, you were a little kid, they had nothing to do with you. She had a long history of hospitalizations for depression, suicidality, and kind of no one had ever sort of put that together. The nurses were busy scurrying around at 2 a.m, trying to figure out what pain medicine to give him. But after that, he stopped calling the nurses. So sometimes I think what chaplains do is they have insight and wisdom that cuts across specific religion. So chaplains describe themselves as now having a post-religious profession, where they're trained to have non-denominational interfaith approaches. And it's part of the training that comes with getting certification, is being able to sort of cut across what people's beliefs are. One chaplain I interviewed said that he walked into a patient's room and knocked on the door and said, I'm the chaplain. And so a short elderly woman said, she did this. She said, you are anathema to me. My religion is CNN. I believe in the facts. I believe in politics and the facts. And he was like, whoa, okay, well, thanks very much. But he decided, let me go back, because she's sort of there by herself. So he went back and knocked the next day and said, hi, remember me? And she went, yeah. And he said, I know your religion is CNN, but let's talk about what's going on politically. And so he sat down and they talked, and she was a very lonely old woman who was like no one else in her life, and this chaplain played this incredibly important role in sort of bonding with her, and was like the only person in her life talking to her to the end of her life. So I think it cuts across sort of beliefs.
Okay.
Yes.
So given the epidemic of private equity companies buying hospitals, seems to me chaplain on the hospital staff might be one of the first things to go.
Yeah.
Are there?
Yeah, so I've made the argument that chaplains, I think, could save hospitals money. And part is because one thing chaplains do is, with end-of-life care, a lot of patients and families want everything done. They want very aggressive treatment when it's futile. So the doctors will say, this is not going to work. And the family will say, no, we want everything done for mother, we want more chemotherapy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, a lot of these chemotherapies, radiation therapies have terrible side effects, so people are miserable. And chaplains are able, and they're trained to talk with patients and families, and in these cases often families, about, you know, what are the goals here? You know, what, in the end, most people would prefer to have their loved one be comfortable at the end of life rather than be miserable and not live much longer, or many people will. But no one's having that conversation. So,
Well, unfortunately, good point, wrong conclusion.
okay,
The hospitals want you to do all these private equity hospitals want you to do all these treatments. It could save Medicare money. It could save the taxpayers money.
Right.
It will not save the hospital. The hospital gets fully reimbursed at whatever their cost is,
Yes.
really. So I'm not sure that's actually.
well, so point well taken. Studies show that when private equity takes over hospitals, the quality of care drops quite a bit. The people die sooner, the quality of care goes down. So I would say a larger problem is I'm wary of private equity companies taking over hospitals, given that so far when that happens, the quality of care has gone down. So, and I don't know how many hospitals private equity has taken over so far. They've taken over some, I know. I was interviewed by Bloomberg about this a few months ago. But it's a concerning trend. I think private equity is moving hugely into clinics. So IVF clinics are now largely owned by venture capital, by private equity companies, et cetera. So chaplains may be, you know, I would hope that that whoever owns a hospital would value patient experiences, right? We can all roll our eyes. You know, you're right, there's a larger issue which is healthcare today. My own sense is that in most hospitals, given the fractured medical system we have, that chaplains do a lot of fill in the gaps here and kind of help in many ways. The other issue is reputationally. So some chaplains that were in medium-sized cities where there was quite a bit of competition between different hospital systems, the chaplains felt that they helped improve patient satisfaction, and that they felt that this would lead to, you know, improve their reputation, like, oh, Hospital X, they really care about you. So that may affect people who are concerned about the bottom line, but your points are very well taken. Jonathan.
You were mentioning that in talking to the deans of medical schools that they weren't interested in having this part of the school. Why do you think that is?
So I still think there's a sense that, you know, we should be teaching medical students biomedicine. You know, kind of, you know, we got to get as much in about the medical treatment of disease, which is understandable.
Right.
I think, though, that to have a little bit on, say, comparative religion, or just on, you know, spiritualism, how to address these issues with patients, would be helpful. And it could just be even a lecture, but I think they don't understand what the it is in some ways. But, you know, so in talking to doctors as part of this too, so doctors fumble a lot on this. So one doctor I interviewed, a few doctors said patients have asked them, "Doctor, do you believe in God?" And they didn't know what to answer. So one was a Protestant doctor, and he had a Muslim patient who had just come over from the Middle East. And the patient knew no one in this country and was nervous and said, "Doctor, do you believe in God?" And the doctor said, "I don't know what to say." I said, finally said, I do, but I'm Protestant. And he said, "Well, thank God you're a person of the book." And so to him, it was a way of trusting, right? So, and often when patients raise these issues, it's more about, can I trust you? Like, here you are, you're about to open up my body and take my organs out, or fiddle around with my organs. Like, can I trust you? Like, who are you? Like, you know, you're a person in a white coat I've never met before, and especially if it's in a different city. So I think establishing that trust. There's also huge Islamophobia. So a lot of Muslim patients, when they go to hospitals now, don't want to write that they're Muslim, because when they go into the hospital, they're afraid they'll get worse care. But I think being aware of these things, I think we need to train doctors to have a little sense of, you know, with Muslim patients, what to do, et cetera, or what's important to them, or if a patient asks you, what should you say? One pediatrician I interviewed who was a very wise guy, a very sensitive man, someone I respect a lot. He said, well, he asked a young boy, how you doing? The kid said, he's the one who said, I hope God is ready for me when I get there. Or I hope God thinks I'm good enough when I meet him. And the doctor said, I'm sure he'll think that. It's like it's like a 6-year-old boy or something. So I think we have to have those kinds of scripts and just be ready. Another doctor said, a patient said to me, do you believe in God? And she said, well, I wasn't sure what to say. I said, well, actually, I'm agnostic. And what I mean by that is it's not that I don't believe that there's a God. It's believe. And she went on this long thing. I started to just ramble. I realized that's not what the guy wanted to know. He wanted to know, yes, I believe that spirituality is important. Okay, thank you. So people we don't train doctors to think about this.
I'm wondering what your experience was or is of doctors encouraging patients to pray. So not doctors praying for you or engaging with you in some spiritual activity, but also, I know in my own work, we talked about as a psychotherapist, how much their own spirituality, a patient's own spirituality or practice brings down their anxiety.
Right.
To the point where they really could go off on vacation. They spent a little time
right.
being quiet and contemplative. And I was just wondering whether, even if a doctor doesn't know what to do about that, do they inquire? Do they help a person practice that while they're in the hospital so that they could maybe be calmer?
So it's, there was a nurse in England who suggested to a patient that she pray, and she got sued.
Oh, geez.
No.
So I think, one has to be careful, and I wrote a piece for the New York Times a few years ago talking about some of these issues, and it got 488 comments. And I just said that doctors should be aware that these issues are important to patients.
But they could say, do you pray? Is that something you
Yes,
do?
so they could say, do you pray? I think you can't prescribe this stuff, but
Right.
I was going to say on the comments, a few people wrote, doctors should not be forcing their religion down patients' throats, which of course is not what I was saying at all, but people have their own beliefs or bugaboos. So I think there was a psychiatrist who I interviewed who said that for several of his patients have difficulty getting along with people, but a few are involved in churches or religious organizations, and he worked with them to help them stay involved in the church. Like, oh, well, so-and-so doesn't like that, they get paranoid. They say, no, you should still go to the church, because he realized that it's an important source of social support for her. And so his work is to get her to continue to be able to access that social support without getting paranoid about, so-and-so, they don't want me in the church anymore, whatever it is. So I think that some doctors ask, is this important to you? I think doctors, particularly end of life, should ask, what's important to you. For some people, there's something spiritual. For some people, it's not. What's it like for you? And I think to help, I think that a lot of doctors, or some doctors do, not enough. Chaplains do that, and I think it would be helpful. But I think doctors could put that in the repertoire more also if they felt comfortable doing it.
I'd like to, is this working? I'd like to ask a question. So we all are told we should have DNRs, we all should have living wills, and most people show up at the hospital, they don't have them with them. The children have absolutely no idea where they are.
Yeah, right.
Why is that?
So this is sort of advanced directive. So everyone should have an advanced directive. Only half the people in America have advanced directives, and these are, documents that say, if God forbid I'm, can't make decisions for myself, and I'm at the end of life, and there are decisions that have to be made about, that I do not want aggressive treatments that are futile, or what I do want or don't want. So half of people don't have these, because who wants to think about their own death? It's not like something people like to think about. It's easier sort of not to think about it. And then of those who have them, only half the time do they get used. And it's either because no one knows where they are, or the person didn't discuss it with their children, which they should have, so the kids don't know. Or you have the phenomenon, I'm the Hospital Ethics Committee at Columbia, and literally every week there's the following case. There's the mother who's dying, and the daughters are here, and they all agree, do nothing heroic. And the At the last minute, the long-lost son shows up from California. And it's always a son, and he's always from the West Coast, and he hasn't talked to mom in several years, or seen mom in several years, and he says, "Don't you dare unplug my mother, or I'll sue your off." And the hospital feels, well, like, we don't want a legal case, what do we do? And we try to talk to the son, and hopefully things work out. But so the problem is we don't deal well with death in this country. There was a book that won the Pulitzer Prize a number of years ago in the 70s called Denial of Death. So everyone knows they're going to die, but let's not think about it. But in fact, and this gets back to Susan's question too, I think the more people think about this in advance, the better off they are, and that they also need to communicate about it with their family, but often don't. Maybe it'll lead to less money to the hospital, but...
So we should create an app so people have their DNRs on them,
that would be
living
great.
wills,
Yep,
and all these
yep.
things, because there's a new app you can put your driver's license on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the bracelets also.
There you go, yeah.
I actually saw one at the state sale, very funny. I was laughing.
There was a case a few years ago, an ethical case, of a guy came into the ER unconscious, and on his chest was a tattoo, "Do not resuscitate."
Yeah.
And the doctors didn't know, what do you do with this?
That's pretty abundant.
It's a true story.
Well, there was a play at the Armory called The Doctor.
Yes.
I saw that.
Yes.
Yeah, which was very, very similar to these kinds of
Yes.
things that you're talking about.
Yes, I thought it got a little convoluted there, with like you didn't
Yeah,
know who was,
well,
right, but it was powerful theater, yes.
But it was a very old play. It was written in the 20s.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that.
And then it was adapted for
Yeah, yeah.
2023.
Yeah, right.
And it was,
It was
very
powerful.
similar
Yep,
about a Jewish doctor and a Catholic
Right,
and
yep.
the parents. It was the young girl was a minor and she was dying from a
Right.
botched abortion, as I recall. And the parents wanted her to have absolution, and the girl had no religious, and the question was, who
Right.
was in control?
Right.
Was the hospital?
Right.
Who, was it the Jewish doctor not wanting to, there was an element of they were at different religions and,
different races then, I think, at a certain point came into it.
oh yeah, well, that was the Armory.
Yeah, right. But yes, very relevant.
Okay, I'd like to have someone who hasn't asked a question before.
Peter.
Okay, hi.
I have a question. Just a few days ago, so 1 day ago, the Nobel Prize in Physics was the people awarded for the creation of artificial intelligence, these deep learning models, whatever. My question is, there are already applications of psychotherapeutic, several you can download and you can consult, and that's just the beginning. What do you think about the future, probably near future, when some of those artificial AI chatbots or whatever would have advantage to overcome some of those limitations you mentioned, that they are not Presbyterian or Catholic, whatever, they are much more flexible, they can much more flexible adapt to the patient or the talking, and not to be biased by personal history because they are AI. So what do you think about this?
So I think that, I don't know about you all, but I find whenever I have to deal with a bot, when I need to call an airline and change a reservation, or am doing with a bank or credit card company, it's incredibly frustrating. Like the bot doesn't quite get it. The bot's, gives you answers that, like, I know that already. I just like, can I talk to a human? No, there's just bots.
Agent.
Yes, right. So if we're saying agent, and it's about changing airline reservation, when it's your life on the line, I think AI is already changing medicine in many ways and has many potential benefits in many aspects of medical care. I think in this area, I'm wary, because I think in this area, people have a need for connection. Now, that being said, the one area I think is interesting, and of course, with AI, there's the introduction of AI, and a lot of hospitals and other places are introducing AI, but not testing how well it works. So buy the AI platform, boom, that's what we're doing. No one says is it working well or not. So in psychotherapy, which can be expensive, particularly in lower middle income countries, there are now psychotherapy apps, right, where there's no therapist. There's just, certain countries have no therapists. And I think that's better than no therapist. It's not as good as a human therapist. So I think, there may be, I think apps can help with some of this, but there are questions. There's also, in general, there have been such AI tools used with kids and with the elderly. So there's now toys you can get that say, hi, my name is Johnny. What's your name? Let's play. What do you? And kind of talks to you, right? And the problem is often, by the way, then you have, and mom and dad get a transcript, and the company has access to the data. But you have things like, you hear the company hears domestic abuse going on or child abuse going on, right? Or what if the person's, and you also with the elderly, there's little puppies that talk to the elderly person, keep them company, and then the person says, I think I'm going to end my life. So it's complicated to sort of, what do you do with the information? So I think they can help in many ways in certain circumstances, but I think on these issues, a one-to-one person is better, if possible.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question.
Jorge.
It's interesting what you said because when my son graduated from Columbia School of Engineering, the commencement was done by Kai-Fu Lee. Kai-Fu Lee is an entrepreneur that only invests in artificial intelligence in about 100 companies. He's a multimillionaire. And 4 years before the commencement, he got lymphoma and he was in all his organs, and they told him he has 3 months to live. And he's facing now death, right? And all he wanted is to have his family together, but he never saw his parents, his mother, because he was always busy working. He never saw his kids, he never saw his friends. So he wanted empathy from his doctors. So the message that he wanted to give the kids is AI can give many things to humans, and his dream is that one day the doctors can do the diagnostics faster and more precise, that it will free their time, that can do even house calls.
Yeah.
Because he felt that what he felt with this experience, the first step to cure the patient was love.
Yeah.
That's why. That was his experience. So I think he is the guru. He started artificial intelligence 10 years ago, and now he's saying that to the kids, who are all computer engineers. This is the message that he wants to leave to them.
Yes, no, that's a great message. I think he's right.
Okay.
I'm not waiting for house calls to come back.
Yeah.
So I want to thank everyone for coming tonight.
And I want to thank you, David, again, and thank Susan and Chip Fisher for hosting us, and thank you all for coming.
And for those of you who, because the books are sold out, who didn't get it, obviously it's available on Amazon, and we hope you'll buy it. It's an incredible book.
There's one book here if someone wants to buy it.
Thank you.